What's up guys, Asian here again with another video, and this is the second video of our 5-part series of how to get started in vet trials. This particular video is aimed at preparing those of you who want to DPS vet trials. This is very specific advice only for DPS. If you're a healer or a tank, you will want to wait until our third and fourth video respectively in order to get your role specific advice as to what to expect from vet trials and how to best prepare for vet trials before you actually start doing vet trials. So we're going to start things off first with what to expect while you are applying to or looking for guilds or teams that run vet trials regularly. Assuming that you haven't joined a vet trials team yet, you're still kind of looking around for one and you kind of want to know what to expect. So the first thing you want to check in on is each individual guild's DPS requirements. So the guild has different requirements for the DPS, but most of them will be looking for at least 20k DPS. That's kind of the bare minimum that you're going to need in order to clear the easiest vet trials, which are the vet crowdlearn trials. So at the very least, you're going to want to hit at least 20k DPS. Now, of course, 20k DPS is kind of subjective, even though it is an absolute number. So you're going to also want to take a look at basically how they measure the DPS. So a lot of people, a lot of guilds will take a look at dummy parses. That's either going to be the 3 million or the 6 million dummy parses. Now, in order to get those parses, if you're on console, you will have to find somebody with a dummy in their house and go to their house, basically do your rotation on the dummy itself, and it'll spit out your DPS. And then I'm sure there is something that you can do to take a screenshot and send it over to whoever is in charge or whoever is recruiting for that guild. If you're on PC, you will be able to, of course, screenshot the exact same thing, or you can use an add-on like Comment Metrics in order to get your DPS meter kind of posted in chat, so that way whoever is recruiting can get a real sense of what your DPS actually is. Now, this is pretty much going to be the basic way of measuring DPS. It's to 3 million or the 6 million dummy. Each guild is going to be a little bit different. The 3 million dummy, for example, is not really considered a good test for sustained DPS, just because the fight itself can last a fairly short period of time. So, for example, it only lasts for about a minute if you're able to pull about 50k DPS or so, which is not very indicative of how well you're able to sustain DPS. So you'll see a lot of guilds are moving over towards a 6 million dummy parse instead of a 3 million dummy parse. That's just because the 6 million dummy is going to be a little bit more indicative of how well you're able to sustain a rotation, sustain your resources, which ever since the Morrowind patch has kind of gone through about a year and a half ago, is going to be a little bit more important for your overall DPS performance. So I would recommend that you practice up on a 3 million dummy first in order to get your rotations down set. Take a look at videos, ask around, maybe there's a good DPS in your guild, but you ask for advice. Practice on a 3 million dummy and then move on to a 6 million dummy in order to be able to see how well you're able to sustain that rotation itself, whether or not you need to change something in order to better sustain yourself, whether that means getting more CP, weaving better, or adding in something like an absorb stamina or absorb magicka enchant. So that's kind of how you can prepare yourself for those DPS tests. So those are basically only for self-buff tests. So self-buff, if you guys are not kind of aware of what goes into a self-buff test, it's basically you're on your own and you're only able to provide whatever buffs you are able to provide for yourself. So you will not get any outside help at all. So no orbs, no worm, and nobody is applying Ellie Drain or Major Fracture for you. So because a lot of classes don't have access to the same debuffs, particularly for stamina DPS, sometimes guilds will have different DPS requirements for specific classes. So for example, Stamina Sorcerer does not have access to Fracture in its skill set. So if you're in the self-buff Stamina Sorc parse, it's going to be lower compared to a Stamina Nightblade self-buff parse, just because a Stamina Nightblade has a Major Fracture built in to surprise attack. So sometimes guilds will have different DPS requirements depending on the class itself. This is mostly or pretty much only for self-buff tests. There's a guild that provides Major Fracture for you. Typically speaking, they'll just have one DPS requirement for all 5 classes. That's something you're going to want to check up on when you take a look at their post on Reddit or their post on the official forums. Just make sure you are crystal clear about what DPS requirements are expected of you in a parse. So a lot of builds some of the higher end guilds actually will provide some buffs for you, and that's because they kind of want to see what your absolute ceiling is going to be. These guilds typically are the high end progression guilds or the leaderboard guilds, if the leaderboard guilds do recruit that way. And typically speaking, you will have to do your parse on a 25 million dummy, usually, or maybe even a 52 million dummy, with some raid buffs. So the raid buffs typically involves things like Combat Prayer, IA for minor vulnerability. You'll get orbs. You'll have Worm if you're magic DPS. So and you also get Warhorn, obviously. So there are a little bit of differences there, obviously, because you're getting buffed. Your DPS requirement does go up as a result. So for the progression style guilds, you will need to be able to demonstrate that your DPS is going to be up to snuff. So for example, with Mayflower, last I checked, our stamina DPS requirement is actually, our stamina DPS requirement is actually 59k on a 25 million dummy with a couple of raid buffs applied. So as you can see, that's a little bit higher than what you would expect from a 20k DPS self-buff dummy test. Now, these will vary a little bit, even depending on the content that you're running. So, like I said, 20k is typically enough for the Cragglorn trials, but if you start going into the DLC trials, you're going to see higher and higher DPS requirements. So, a very classic DPS requirement for things like Vet Maw is 30k DPS. Classic one for Vet Hall of Fabrication, for example, is like 30k or 35k DPS. So if you are going to be shooting for those DLC trials, you will want to get higher and higher DPS. So that's going to be around 30k, 35k is a good number to shoot for as a bare minimum in order to get into guilds. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that doing a parse on a dummy is not exactly the same as parsing in a trial. A lot of people like to point that out, that DPS in a trial is going to be different from DPS on a dummy, and that is certainly the case. So some guilds, and this is not all of them, will actually have you run a vet trial with them, something like Ethereum Archive, a very easy vet trial, in order to get your actual in-raid parse. These are very far and few between. I have actually not seen a guild that does this, but I do know that some guilds will actually do this. Now, once you're in a guild and you are a DPS and you're running vet trials, some guilds will require you to post a DPS parse after each boss fight or after each trial on the final boss. So, for example, the Maid, the Serpent, Rakat, etc., etc. It is important for you to do that because that way the raid lead is able to kind of keep tabs of whether DPS is improving, and that gives them an idea of what kind of content you guys can create next, what content to run next week, as well as just track overall progress for each raid member. One thing to remember is that your position on a raid team is not always going to be secure. There's a lot of things that go through a raid lead's mind when deciding whether or not to remove somebody from the team because they're underperforming, and so on. So one thing you're going to have to keep in mind is you always want to improve. So just because you made that DPS check and you are part of the guild now doesn't mean that your spot on the team is safe. So if somebody else comes around who pulls higher DPS, who's dying less in trials, who's pulling higher DPS in trials, who is more consistent with showing up maybe, or is more active in the guild Discord or something like that, your position might end up being jeopardized. So when you join a vet trials guild, make sure you are prepared, again, like we said in the first video, for that time commitment to improve yourself. The big thing with that raid leads look for is improvement. It's not just kind of staying in place, running in place, it's continuing to improve. Obviously, as you get higher and higher, there's less and less room in order for you to improve, in which case, instead of looking at just raw numbers like DPS, you'll be taking a look at things like in-raid performance. How often are you rezzing? How often are you dying? Things like that. Those are all things that you're going to want to keep in mind as you start entering the vet trials environment. These are the kind of things that raid leads take a look at when we are kind of deciding who to bring on to our teams, whether that's a progression team or a more casual guild. Just something that you want to keep in mind in the back of your head. Now, in terms of sets, a lot of guilds don't have actually any required sets. As long as you're able to make that DPS check, you can run whatever sets you want. So, for example, if you are running something like, let's say you're running Hunding's Rage with Briarheart, and you manage to make 35k, and your cutoff is 25k for that guild. Doesn't matter that you're not wearing Reliquin, doesn't matter that you don't have Advanced Yokeda, you will still be able to get into that guild. So, like I said, a lot of guilds don't actually have gear requirements. Don't feel like you have to farm up Reliquin before you apply for a guild. Don't feel like you have to farm up Warrior or anything like that. As long as you're able to meet that DPS check, most guilds will say, all right, you're in, you made the check, There's always obviously going to be room to improve, but you are in for you are in because you just made the check. Now that being said, as obviously as you get higher and higher and you want to run harder and harder content, you will need more and more DPS. In which case, it is going to be beneficial for you to get those sets, those Reliquants, those Sivorius, that Spell Strategist, Mantucata, so on and so forth. So while you don't necessarily have to get the meta sets, the best in slot sets, it is in your best interest to get those sets in case you ever want to higher up in the Trials hierarchy. So now, for progression style guilds and leaderboard guilds, if you're a Nightblade, Templar, or Warden, regardless if you're Magicka or Stamina, you should prepare to wear either Master Architect if you're Magicka or War Machine if you're Stamina. This is primarily because Major Slayer, the buff itself, is actually very powerful, and it really helps out your group members. So because those three classes have very low cost ultimates, they're typically going to be the ones that are going to be wearing those Major Slayer sets. Now, if you have obviously a lot of Nightblades, for example, you might not have to wear these sets, but you should still be prepared to be asked to wear Master Architect or War Machine. This does mean that you will need to have access to the Morrowind expansion. It is part of ESO Plus now. If you just have an ESO Plus membership, you will be able to run Halls of Fabrication. You'll get these sets. So that's just something you want to keep in mind. Typically speaking, most groups will run 2 or 3 Major Slayer sets, usually 2. So again, if you have like 4 Nightblades, then you might not have to wear War Machine or Master Architect. One of your other Nightblades might have to do so, but you still want to be prepared with that set in case your typical Major Slayer buffer is not able to make a raid for whatever reason. So again, I really want to emphasize that while you're running vet trials, raid leads are going to be looking for performance and improvement. You're expected, of course, to maintain at least the same level of performance between each trial, and at the you do want to show that you're improving, that you're making progress, especially in progression style guilds, where, like I mentioned, your position on the team is not always going to be set in stone. So one of the most important things, again, going these vet trials, is to just continue to improve yourself and continue to show the raid lead that you are committed to the team, that you do want to improve and move on to harder and harder content. And that's pretty much it for any sort of specific advice to DPS. So kind of the main takeaway points are to keep an eye on those DPS requirements. Of course, these requirements can shift over time. So for example, Hellfire Dominion, we've had to change the DPS requirements several times over the course of the guild history. So just keep in mind, another emphasis on improving yourself. The DPS requirement will only always go up. It will never end up going down. So that's just something that you want to keep in mind. So definitely keep an eye on those DPS requirements. Always seek to improve yourself. Even if you're on a guild, in a team, you still want to make sure to improve yourself, because you always want to assume that your position in a raid team is not secure, it is not guaranteed. Finally, while there are no set requirements, if you're a Nightblade, Templar, or Warden, do be prepared to run Master Architect or War Machine, especially in progression style guilds, just for that Major Slayer buff. If you guys have any other pieces of advice that you want to share, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. If you guys have questions or comments about this advice, again, leave them down in the comment section below and I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. So that concludes this second video for DPS, how to get started into vet trials, what to expect from vet trials. On our next video, we'll be going over the specifics for the healer roles. Obviously, healers will not have sort of DPS checks or requirements, so we'll be going over what to expect and how to best prepare for a trial as a healer. Thanks for watching this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.